Um, I first got the idea for this presentation back in February when writers were speculating about the rosters for the upcoming World Baseball Classic. Bradford Doolittle of ESPN wrote, "Our imaginations were captured by some prospective lineups that looked absolutely stacked. While it'll be decades before we know how many Hall of Famers will be featured in the tournament, which begins next week, we know that there will be many. The level of talent in this tournament, especially among the top few teams, is unprecedented." And the possible lineups that were being suggested were certainly remarkable, like Team USA with an outfield of Mookie Betts, Mike Trout, and Bryce Harper, plus a host of all-stars all around the diamond. Or this lineup for the Dominican Republic, which fancifully shifted Jose Ramirez to second base. With all-stars at every position, this particular team inspired awe in some observers. Blue Jays pitcher Chris Bassett told The Athletic's Ken Rosenthal, "They're without a doubt the team to beat. It will probably go down as the best lineup ever. 1 to 9 is an MVP candidate. I mean, literally. We'll compare it to other lineups in like 20 years and say this is still the best one ever." In the event, those Dominicans didn't even reach the final, which was won by a Japan squad that was apparently just as talented, even if most American observers recognized just one of the players' names. But what really got me thinking was that original premise, that the level of talent in this tournament, especially among the top few teams, is unprecedented. In the history of National and American League Baseball, the only squads comparable to those in the WBC were the ones selected for the annual All-Star Game, which is, of course, just a one-off exhibition. But there had never been teams like these before, playing in a real competition until the World Baseball Classic, at least in the history of National and American League Baseball. But in the history of segregated blackball, there were a number of what I'm calling super teams. All-star level squads either entered in some official competition or competing at the highest level available at that time to a black baseball team. Particularly during periods of instability and the lack of a strong league structure, circumstances in blackball permitted the short-term creation of some unique squads that could certainly compete with those in the WBC. Picking up where my last presentation left off, our first super team is the 1905 Philadelphia Giants. The Giants were founded 3 years earlier by the legendary Saul White, already one of blackball's most famous and accomplished figures. The club would soon become the crowning achievement of White's Hall of Fame career. In just their second season, they were good enough to challenge the reigning Cuban ex-Giants for black baseball supremacy. And a year later, in 1904, after raiding several of the ex-Giants stars, they defeated their rivals in a famous championship series in Atlantic City. They continued their raiding in the off-season and came out in 1905 with the strongest black ball club anyone had ever seen. Saul White was 37 years old, and though still team captain, he mostly used himself as a reserve. Pete Hill in left field was just 22 years old and already the best hitter in blackball. He'd go on to become one of the greatest players of the dead ball era, black or white. 32-year-old shortstop Grant Johnson, the last star taken from the Cuban ex-Giants, was nothing less than the greatest black ball player of his generation. Third baseman Bill Monroe and second baseman Charlie Grant were both great ball players and with arguably Hall of Fame credentials, while catcher Pete Booker and first baseman Harry Moore were each all-star level talents. Rube Foster was in the middle of an extended run as the best black pitcher in baseball. And Foster's former rival for that crown, Danny McClellan, was now his teammate, giving the Phils an unbeatable 1-2 punch. 19-year-old Emmett Bowman was both the third pitcher and the club's regular center fielder, while whichever pitcher wasn't starting usually manned right field. The club had a 134-21-3 record for an incredible .858 winning percentage. They defeated 9 white minor league teams and were undefeated against African-American opponents. And incredibly, in an era where about 10% of white major league games were shutouts, the Phillies played 158 games without ever being held scoreless. On the mound, all 3 starting pitchers, Foster, McClellan, and Bowman, turned in 30-win seasons. And in October of 1905, while America's attention was fixed on the World Series between Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics and John McGraw's New York Giants, a Philadelphia team at least as good as the A's was easily claiming another black baseball championship in near anonymity. Several ball clubs from the 19-teens could qualify for super team status. The black population in the urban centers of the North was growing, and strong new teams were being formed just about every summer. But there was still no centralized league authority, which meant an ambitious team could collect and hoard talent in ways that wouldn't be possible just a decade later. While there were several candidates from this era for this presentation, I settled on the Lincoln Giants of 1913. Full admission, this is one of my favorite blackball clubs ever. I grew up in New York and am very connected to that city's baseball history. Surprisingly, much of New York's blackball history was second rate. But these Lincolns were one of the best sides ever and an important New York side attraction during the Harlem Renaissance. It's said that the best teams are strong up the middle, and the Lincoln Giants had one of the strongest spines ever. Hall of Famers at short and catcher in Pop Lloyd and Louis Santop, and should be Hall of Famers in center fielder Spotswood Poles and second baseman Grant Johnson, who's currently the first person I'd add to the ranks of Cooperstown if only someone would grant me the authority. The pitching 1-2 is another Hall of Famer and should be Hall of Famer. Smokey Joe Williams was the greatest black pitcher before Satchel Paige, and Cannonball Dick Redding was probably the hardest thrower of his era. Bill Francis and Leroy Grant were a pair of all-star talents at the corners, as was left fielder Judy Gans. Joe Hewitt in right was early in a long career as player and manager. He was the skipper of the 1931 Cleveland Cubs, whose home was the mysterious Hardware Field at 79th and Kinsman. Doc Wiley was a skillful catcher who frequently started behind the plate while Louis Santop moved to right to keep his bat in the lineup. And Andrew Jack Payne highlighted the New Yorkers' solid bench. Big Bertha, Louis Santop, was the Lynx hitting star, famous for his towering home runs, while Joe Williams made the headlines for his strong mound performances. The captain and manager of the team was shortstop John Henry Lloyd, who legendary white manager Connie Mack claimed was equal in every way to the great Hannes Wagner. The Lincoln Giants defeated Rube Foster's Chicago American Giants in a lengthy series that summer to claim the Black Baseball Championship. And in October, they defeated the National League's Philadelphia Phillies in a famous matchup in Harlem, with Joe Williams out-pitching Grover Cleveland Alexander, who'd just gone 22-8 while leading the National League in shutouts. For most of the 1910s, the Lincoln Giants spent their winters in Palm Beach, Florida, competing in the 2-team Florida Hotel League, colloquially known as the Coconut League. 2 luxury hotels competed in the Coconut League, the Royal Poinciana and the Breakers, in an annual series of games games featuring leading Black teams competing for the entertainment of the wealthy white clientele. The two hotels were owned by the same company and were within walking distance of each other. The larger Royal Poinciana on the left sat on the shore of Lake Worth, while the Breakers bordered the Atlantic Ocean. The Lincolns represented the Royal Poinciana, while the Breakers employed either C.I. Taylor's Indianapolis ABCs or Rube Foster's Chicago American Giants. Both sides were frequently supplemented by players from other teams, making them strong candidates for super team status. The Florida Hotel League employed Black baseball talent for over a decade. Statistics for 3 of those seasons, 1915 to 17, have been compiled by the amazing folks at Seamheads. And a glance at the 2 rosters tells us that no less than 6 American Hall of Famers and 1 Cuban Hall of Famer competed in games that existed only for the entertainment of the Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Astors of the world, who were doubtlessly oblivious to the level of greatness they were witnessing. In the 1920s, a strong Negro League structure precluded the emergence of super teams in the States. So we next turn our attention to the baseball mad island of Cuba. The 1920s were the heyday of the strong Cuban Winter League. Being a thoroughly integrated country, the teams in the Cuban League featured both light and dark-skinned Cubans, as well as players from the white major leagues and the Negro leagues, providing a unique opportunity for Black stars to prove themselves on a level playing field. Unsurprisingly, the Negro League stars in Cuba regularly demonstrated that they could compete with any of the white major leaguers. One particular all-Black team, representing the provincial city of Santa Clara, is fondly remembered to this day as the greatest ball club the island has ever seen. The backbone of the 1923-24 Leopards de Santa Clara, the Santa Clara Leopards, was their legendary outfield of Alejandro Ohms, Oscar Charleston, and Pablo Mesa. Charleston, of course, may have been the greatest Negro leaguer of all, and at age 27 was firmly in his prime as a hitter, slugger, base stealer, and gold glove center fielder. Ohms and Mesa are both members of the Cuban Hall of Fame, with Ohms, El Caballero, remembered as one of the country's greatest hitting talents. The left side of the infield was equally imposing. Shortstop Dobie Moore would be a slam dunk Hall of Famer had he played longer than 7 seasons, but his career was ended by the injuries he suffered when a jealous woman shot him. And Oliver Ghost Marcel beat out Hall of Famers Judy Johnson and Ray Dandridge for the title of Blackball's greatest third baseman in the famous Pittsburgh Courier poll of 1952. The right side of the infield was ably manned by Negro League veterans Frank Warfield and Eddie Douglas, and Heavy Johnson replaced Douglas during the season, giving the Leopards another one of the most fearsome bats of the era. 2 of Black baseball's best backstops, Frank Duncan and Julio Rojo, alternated behind the plate, while Cuban Esteban Montalvo provided depth from the bench. The Santa Clara pitching staff was at least equally as talented. Left fielder Dave Brown was also denied a place in Cooperstown by a prematurely shortened career, though in his case, he pulled the trigger, going underground after murdering a man in New York. Elvis Bill Holland was one of the brightest young pitchers in the Negro National League and jumped to the Eastern Colored League after this winter in Cuba. 38-year-old Hall of Famer and Cuban legend Jose Mendez provided capable relief. And finally, there's Rube Curry, who starred in pennant-winning rotations with the Kansas City Monarchs, Hilldale, and the Chicago American Giants. The Leopards so completely dominated play that winter that the Cuban League abandoned its schedule mid-season due to lack of competitiveness. A second schedule was put together with last place Marianao's players split up between Habana and Almendares to improve those two teams, and all the games moved to the capital city. But Santa Clara won that title anyway. Unlike most leagues featuring black stars, the Cuban leagues kept thorough statistics, so we have official figures on Santa Clara's many accomplishments. Oscar Charleston led the league in both on-base percentage and slugging percentage, as well as runs scored, walks, and stolen bases. And native son Alejandro Ohms put up these impressive numbers while winning the league's equivalent of the Most Valuable Player award. Shortstop Dobie Moore led the league in hits, RBIs, and triples, and was second to Charleston in slugging percentage. And third baseman Oliver Marcel surprisingly led the league in home runs while enjoying a stellar campaign. On the mound, the Big Four pitchers all put up impressive numbers, with Bill Holland's star shining brightest on what is known today as Cuba's greatest ball club. In October 1929, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression officially began, although the Black community had been experiencing the effects of a major economic turndown for several years already. When I think of the impact the Depression had on Black baseball, I'm reminded of some lines from William Butler Yeats. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. In a matter of a few short years, the strong league structure of Black baseball collapsed. From 1924 to 27, there had been 2 leagues and a regular postseason World Series. In 1928, the Eastern Colored League collapsed. The next year, a new Eastern League, the American League, Negro League, barely completed the season. And in 1930 and 31, there was no league baseball in the East, while out west, the Negro National League was on its last legs. The man who took full advantage of this chaos was Cumberland Posey, who joined a Pittsburgh area sandlot team called the Homestead Grays in 1911, became their manager in 1916, and purchased the club in the early 1920s. Posey nurtured Homestead into an Eastern blackball powerhouse. The Grays were regularly courted by the 2 Negro leagues, but for the most part preferred their standing as an independent. And it was that independence that positioned them, when the leagues fell apart, to assemble a 1931 squad that many experts consider the greatest blackball club of all time. The cornerstone of the 1931 Grays were 3 of the towering figures in blackball history. 34-year-old Oscar Charleston shifted from center field to first base in deference to his age, but still one of the game's most formidable hitters. Josh Gibson was just 19 years old, but already a legend thanks to his incredible power. And the amazing Smokey Joe Williams was 45 years old, but continuing a late career renaissance while continuing to blaze a career path later followed by Satchel Paige. Second baseman George Scales and left fielder Vic Harris were a couple of veteran Grays who were deserving of serious Cooperstown consideration, while Lefty Williams and George Britt were solid holdover Grays on the pitching staff. To this talented core, the 1931 squad added Hall of Famer Judd Boojum Wilson, a ferocious line drive machine. Pitcher Willie Foster, another Hall of Famer and arguably blackball's greatest ever left-hander. Outfielder Ted Page, who enjoyed some all-star level seasons in the 1930s. And the legendary Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, who could contribute both on the mound and behind the plate, sometimes pitching and catching in the same game. With so much offensive firepower, the Grays were able to complete their squad with a few light-hitting glove men. This club completely dominated the opposition all season long. According to research by Phil Dixon, the Grays had a record of 130, 28, and 2, an 819 winning percentage. They played 684 ball against leading black and white minor league teams and went 27-1 in the month of May. The batting order's big five of Charleston, Gibson, Wilson, Page, and Scales each had at least 200 hits, 20 doubles, 17 home runs, and 150 runs scored. While the pitching staff featured 4 20-game winners. In early October 1931, the Cleveland Plain Dealer promoted an exhibition game at Cleveland Stadium featuring several former Indians stars, including the battery of George Yulee and Steve O'Neill, world champions with the tribe 11 years earlier. Burying the lead, the newspaper hid the fact that the opposition would be arguably the most talented team in Negro League baseball history. The Grays left little doubt who was the superior team, spanking the Steve O'Neill All-Stars 18-0. But the Plain Dealer gives us no specifics about Homestead's exploits, and you needed to turn to the Black Pittsburgh Courier to discover that Josh Gibson smashed 2 long home runs at the stadium that day. At the same time that the Grays were destroying inferior competition in anonymity, the Philadelphia Athletics and St. Louis Cardinals were battling in the World Series, entertaining a nation that was under the delusion these were the 2 best teams in the land. The following spring, that same Cumberland Posey, long an opponent of league baseball, decided to fill the void in the blackball landscape by organizing an ambitious new league. The East-West League featured 8 teams spread out much further geographically than any Eastern League had ever attempted. They also announced an extensive schedule with more frequent league games than any black circuit before it. Both decisions were economically questionable, particularly in the middle of the Depression. Posey handed the reins of his Homestead Grays to his brother Seward and headed to the Motor City to organize a new team, the Detroit Wolves, replacements for the recently folded Detroit Stars of the late Negro National League. In the process, Posey assembled his second super team in 2 years. Posey based his team around the remains of the St. Louis Stars, final champions of the Negro National League, who had folded just months earlier. We start with a trio of Hall of Famers: center fielder Cool Papa Bell, shortstop Willie the Devil Wells, and first baseman Mule Suttles. That St. Louis squad also provided a pair of all-star talents in third baseman Dewey Creasy and the underrated catcher Tom Young, and 2 pitching aces in Burt Buffalo Hunter and Big Florida, Ted Trent. Also joining from St. Louis was 19-year-old Quincy Troop, who split his time between the outfield and catcher while playing well enough to hold his own with the big boys. From the Homestead Grays, Posey brought over left fielder Vic Harris, the venerable Smokey Joe Williams, another Hall of Fame hurler, young Ray Brown, who split his time between the mound and the outfield, and reliable Lefty Williams. Another star pitcher, former Kansas City Monarch William Bell, rounded out the deep and impressive pitching staff. The manager of the team was former Indianapolis ABC's pitching star Dizzy Dismukes. When the Wolves buried the Baltimore Black Sox 15-3 in mid-June, it was the club's 14th consecutive league victory, and they were runaway leaders in the East-West League standings. But the league was crumbling under the financial strain and fell apart completely just weeks later. The Wolves were merged with their sister club, the Homestead Grays, which theoretically would have created a monstrous super team. But the players dispersed in the chaos that followed, and nobody's rosters remained very stable during the remainder of that crazy summer as players struggled to hook on with a team that could pay them. The Detroit Wolves East-West League adventure lasted just 6 weeks, but for that short time, they dominated all opposition with one of the finest ball clubs to ever take the field. For our next super team, we turn our attention to Denver, Colorado, where the local newspaper held an annual semi-pro baseball tournament. The Denver Post tournament was started in 1915, with that first edition involving 8 Colorado-based teams. By the 1930s, the tourney had become national in scope, with as many as 20 teams competing for large cash prizes in what had become known as the Little World Series of the West. In 1934, Denver's Little World Series made headlines by becoming the first major baseball competition in the United States to integrate. Or, as the black newspaper, the Atlanta Daily World announced, Negro baseball nines to get chance against O'Fays. The Kansas City Monarchs were selected to integrate the tournament, and their already strong ranks were augmented by a few Chicago American giants, including Hall of Famers Willie Foster and Turkey Stearns. But the Monarchs were beaten by a House of David team that employed the great Satchel Paige for the occasion. Satch was the star of the tournament, winning 3 games in 5 days, including a 2-1 nail-biter over Kansas City's Chet Brewer in the final. The following season, the post-tournament's sole black representative was the local Denver White Elephants, who impressed observers by finishing a very respectable 5th. The White Elephants were led by our old friend Oliver Ghost Marcel, who we last saw leading the Cuban League in homers with Santa Clara. Marcel had relocated to Denver and put together a ball club that some historians consider the equal to many established Negro League sides. Marcel was also instrumental in getting the post-tournament integrated, making the original suggestion to organizers that they should invite the Monarchs in 1934. In 1936, the owners of the Negro National League decided to make a statement about the playing ability of black players denied a place in so-called organized baseball. They entered an all-star team in the prestigious post-tournament, comprised of members of the Pittsburgh Crawfords, Homestead Grays, and Washington Elite Giants. This is considered the greatest team to take the field in Denver until that city hosted the Major League All-Star Game in 1998, and it's my personal favorite Blackball super team. We start in the best possible way, with Josh and Satch of the Pittsburgh Crawfords, 2 towering figures in blackball history, both of them right in their prime. The Craw's cool Papa Bell was featured in center field in the leadoff slot in the batting order. Also from Pittsburgh came shortstop Chester Williams and the very fine and underrated spitball pitcher named Sam Streeter. The Crawfords' hometown rivals, the Homestead Grays, contributed 2 Hall of Famers and 1 should-be Hall of Famer in first baseman Buck Leonard, pitcher Ray Brown, and left fielder Vic Harris. Wild Bill Wright in right field of the Washington Elite Giants was one of the great unsung players of his era. His Cooperstown-worthy career took too many international twists and turns to be properly recognized. Washington also provided Sammy Hughes, a perennial all-star at second base, and veteran third baseman Felton Snow, as well as 6'3" right-hander Bob Griffith. Bob Hardy and Boise Jack Marshall, a pair of Western-based veterans of the Negro National League, joined the Eastern-based Stars en route to Denver and rounded out the squad. The Negro League All-Stars made a mockery of the tournament that summer, sweeping 7 straight games and dominating what had been considered the strongest tournament field to date. Satchel Paige struck out 18 while shutting out the Eason Oilers of Enid, Oklahoma in the final. And newspapers from coast to coast ran headlines about a team of Negroes dominating the famous Denver Post tournament. For our final Blackball super team, we turn our attention to the eastern side of the island of Santo Domingo and the baseball mad nation of the Dominican Republic. A military dictator named Rafael Trujillo seized power in 1930 and ruthlessly reshaped all of Dominican society with a cruel and bloody reign focused primarily on the worship of Rafael Trujillo. He even changed the name of the 428-year-old capital city of Santo Domingo to Ciudad Trujillo. Old world charm in a modern setting, according to the tourist map, though I'm sure Trujillo's enemies experienced a far less charming reality. In 1937, the Dominican Baseball League was renamed El Campeonato Nacional de Béisbol por reelección de Presidente Trujillo, the National Baseball Championship for the re-election of President Trujillo. For this very special occasion, the capital city's eternal rivals, Los Tigres del Licey and Los Leones del Escogido, would be merged into one side, Los Dragones de Ciudad Trujillo, the Trujillo City Dragons, whose sole purpose was to win the championship for the re-election of Presidente Trujillo and bring glory and honor to the Trujillo name. But Aguilas Cibaeñas from the provincial city of Santiago didn't read the script. Led by Cuban great Martin Diego, they threatened to run away with the title and spoil the Trujillo celebration. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and in a last-ditch effort to bring victory to the capital city, Trujillo's henchmen used large sums of cash to coerce choice Negro League talent to the island. The result was the legendary Dragones team, remembered to this day as possibly the finest to ever play in the Caribbean. We start once again with Josh and Satch. Page was one of the first Negro leaguers to join the Dominicans and was an important recruiter of talent. Gibson, on the other hand, was one of the last Blackball stars to join the team, loyally explaining to Grays owner Cumberland Posey that he couldn't turn down that much money and promising to return to Homestead after the Dominican season. Once again, the center fielder and leadoff hitter was legendary Hall of Famer Cool Papa Bell. And there was a fourth Hall of Famer on the team, Cuban first baseman Lázaro Salazar, a Hall of Famer in his native Cuba, who starred briefly in the United States with the New York Cubans. The Pittsburgh Crawfords double play combo of Harry Williams and Sam Bankhead manned the middle of the diamond. Bankhead was one of Blackball's biggest stars and played in 8 East-West games. Third baseman Silvio Garcia was another Cuban superstar who would feature 10 years later on the New York Cubans National League champions. Jabbo Andrews and Satchel Paige's personal catcher, Cy Perkins, were the other Negro leaguers on the team, while left fielder Tony Castaño was another Cuban star who twice led his country's league in batting and would hit over 300 in the International League after integration. Joining Satch on the mound were veteran all-star Leroy Matlock and Bob Griffith, who had joined many of these players in Denver the summer before. Then there was the Bull, Perucho Cepeda, Puerto Rican legend and father of the Baby Bull, Hall of Famer Orlando Cepeda, and Cuban veteran Jose Vargas, who some sources mistakenly identify as Dominican great Tegolo Vargas, who actually competed against these Dragones for rivals Aguilas. Now, if you want to read a good baseball story and learn the details of the Ciudad Trujillo team, I recommend The Pitcher and the Dictator by Avril Ace Smith. Impeccably researched and fun to read, it sets the story straight on what has become a baseball legend. But if you'll forgive me, today we're going to listen to the legend. The white baseball world learned about this team from the tales told by Satchel Paige. After reading Smith's book, I can really appreciate how much liberty Satch took with the facts. But like a good poem, the essence of the truth is contained here, and Satch tells the story far more entertainingly than I ever could. So from 1948's Pitchin' Man, as told to the Cleveland Plain Dealer's Hal Leibovitz. One winter, a man by the name of Dr. Jose Enrique Ibar money-talked most of us Pittsburgh Crawford players into going down to San Domingo to play for a town named Ciudad Trujillo. The town was named after the president of San Domingo, Rafael El Trujillo. He was the boss of everything, and we was his team. Dr. Abar was the manager, and when he got us down there, he said, "Boys, here's some advice. You better win." "What do you mean?" I asked. He didn't have to answer. I see a soldier standing by tugging at a gun. From then on, all I could see was Trujillo's soldiers tugging at guns. We was his team, you understand, and we was supposed to advertise he was a winner by winning ourselves. Politics, you understand. If we went swimming, the soldiers with guns were chaperones. We had soldiers on our hotel floors, too. Trujillo gave orders anyone in town selling us whiskey would be shot. I didn't mind the soldiers, but the guns was getting me jittery. Then Trujillo cooks up a series with a team called the Estrellas de Oriente. Who do you think was running that team but the man who was trying to beat Trujillo out for the presidentship? See the politics they was playing? It was like the election depended on the series. The Estrellas weren't no easy picking. They was loaded with American players too. We was jittery and we lost 3 out of the first 6 games. The final and main game was played in Trujillo's town. 7,000 people was in the stands and they all had knives and guns. I tried to play sick because I was sick, believe me. But they stuck a gun at my head and I got well. The umpires was Trujillo's men too. I knowed if I threw the ball anywhere, it would be a strike because the umpires saw the guns too. But I was shaking like a leaf in a high breeze and they had us 5-4 going into the 7th. We got 2 runs that inning and I said to myself, "Listen, Satch," I couldn't talk to myself without stuttering. "Pull yourself together before they air condition you." Well, we lucked through the next 2 innings and won 6-5. The American Council heard what a worrisome situation we was in, and they flew us out in a bird that same night. Later in the States, I was reading a statement from Dr. Abar that baseball in Trujillo City ain't commercial. Money makes no difference, he said. Baseball is spiritual in every respect, as indulged by the Latin races. Them guns wasn't spiritual, but they near made a spirit out of me. The Blackball stars who jumped to the Dominican were threatened with lengthy suspensions, but there was little chance the clubs would enforce the continued absence of their biggest drawing cards. So instead, the contract jumpers were booked to play a long and lucrative series of exhibition games against a team of league all-stars after they returned to the States. All except for Josh Gibson, who stayed true to his word and returned to the Homestead Grays. That 1937 season saw the return of two league baseball, and with it a sense of stability and balanced competition that marked the end of blackball super teams. But as we've seen, blackball history is dotted with some super teams more talented than any white contemporaries, but denied a place at the table and relegated to obscurity for the most asinine of reasons, the complexion of their skin. Among my sources for today's extravaganza, Peter Barkman's History of Cuban Baseball, Phil Dixon's American Baseball Chronicles. Man wrote a volume on the '05 Philadelphia Giants and another one on the '31 Grays. Larry Lester and Company's Black Baseball in Detroit. Jay Sanford's History of the Denver Post Tournament, and Earl Averill Ace Smith's The Pitcher and the Dictator. I knew I was going to call him Earl Averill at some point. Websites include Agate Type, the Sabre Biography Project, and the Sabre Games Project. The statistics and portraits came from seamheads.com. The clippings from newspapers.com, the Cleveland Public Library, and the best thing my Sabre subscription has ever done for me, the ProQuest Historical Black Newspapers database. I'd like to thank our collaborators, Lifeline Sports, the Community Cup Classic, P5, the Partnership, and some other guy. Special thanks to our most valuable partner, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. And I'd especially like to thank all of you for joining us each month for our continuing celebration of Blackball history. And invite you to join us next month and each month following. In September, I'll be taking a look at the inaugural East-West All-Star Game. In October, Ike will be talking about the 75th anniversary of the Major League Baseball World Series. In November, we'll be taking a look at the baseball art of Dominic De Niro. Ooh. And in December, a recap of 2023.